Insofar as the parts are easily available, actually. There's lots of new sources that we'll be going over. And just the big thing that's changed is just that the parts aren't easily available by just walking into your dealer like it used to be. Those things are going away pretty quick. GM's discontinuing parts every week. And, but it's not a problem, it's not a concern. It just makes searching for parts, it just makes shopping for parts different. You're still going to find the parts. The parts that are needed the most are the ones that are the easiest to get. Some parts are very hard to get, but they're typically parts that you're not going to need, like cylinder heads, for example, or a cylinder block. These things you'd only destroy on a racing engine or something like that. Typically, they're not needed, so you don't have to worry about these things. If cylinder heads aren't available, and they're generally not, it's nothing for the typical owner to worry about because the car almost will never need something like that. In fact, I could just about guarantee that you're not going to need it if the car is driven on the street and occasional drag strip use. Next slide. Next slide. Your electrical parts on the car that are probably on your probably the top items that people are concerned about. Number one, of course, is the ECM. The ECM is available through Delco. Delco just started a new service arrangement for the LT5 ECMs. For about a year, GM would tell you that that parts were unavailable. They did not discontinue the part. That's an interesting thing to understand about the GM part system. If they don't stock a part, but it's not discontinued, it might come back because it might mean that they're in the process of looking for a new source for this particular part. And that indeed is what happened with the ECM. There's a new ECM, there's a new company that rebuilds ECMs for Delco. You have to supply a core. They're rebuilding your unit essentially. So you have to supply them with a defective unit and a VIN number, and you will get a remanufactured unit in return. So this is pretty important because that ECM is indeed used only on the LT5 engine. So it's good that they put this in place. Starters are no problem. I believe I heard this just this weekend that again there's some nuances on how you search for parts. Yes, Ted?
Can you give a ballpark price as to what the charge is?
Oh, I don't want to get into too much of this because there's only so much I can remember. Those ECMs I think are about 180 bucks.
Yeah, that's all. Wow.
Right. None of these parts are expensive because they're coming from ordinary supply sources. Okay. The GM starters, one interesting nuance that somebody just mentioned to me this weekend was that if you ask GM for that part number, they'll tell you that it's discontinued, but a good GM parts guy will cross-reference that into the Delco remanufactured part. Okay. I'll do questions after we're finished. Okay.
Go to AutoZone.
Well, we're going to go over that too. AutoZone has, there's a lot of other sources. That's the primary point of my talk today, is that a lot of people go to the dealer, and when the dealer turns them away, they start heading for eBay or something crazy like that. Well, that's the last thing you should be doing. There's a lot of other sources, and you'd be surprised how other suppliers have stepped in to handle this. The starters will be available probably forever. The only thing that's unique to the starter is the case, the casting that it's in. All the rest of the pieces are common Nimp and Denso parts. They're used on hundreds of different Asian cars. They're used also, I know, on a Chrysler minivan V6. So as far as brushes and the component parts, those parts will be available for a very long time because all these other applications share the same parts. I actually have acquired some of the remanufactured parts, some of those component parts, so I actually, about half it depends, I give my customers a choice. I can either supply a remanufactured Delco unit, or I can recondition the unit that they have, the solenoid and the brushes and the contacts. Again, all those parts are just very easy to get from any, you know, there's multiple sources around the country that service these things. Alternator's kind of in the same class. Common parts inside the alternator. I'm not so sure about the frame, if that's unique to the LT5, but if it is, that's no big deal, because everybody here has a frame on their car. You know, as long as you have a broken one, you're going to have a reconditioned one. So, but currently the alternators are available from Delco. Nice, high quality remanufactured units. The ignition module is one of the parts that you don't want to need. Okay, it's unique to the ZR-1. GM has just a few of them left in their system, as I understand. It appears that nobody has snapped these things up because they're expensive.
You can't find them. They're gone.
Okay. Well, like I said, you don't want to need this module. And the thing is, you shouldn't have to worry about it very much. In the 8 years that I've been servicing LT5s exclusively, I've only seen 3 of them fail. 2 of those certainly failed because of incorrect installation. Well, one was a tuner that I won't name. When I took it off, there was gritty material, there was sand between the, you know, what they did is they took it off and there's the heat conductive grease, thermal grease. They apparently took it off, left it laying around the shop for a while, put it back on, thought the stuff would kind of glue back together, and it was the gritty stuff in there that held it away. I had another one that was put together, believe it or not, some totally, I don't even know how to classify it, some clueless person, put it together with washers underneath the bolts, so it was actually insulated. There's an airspace between the bottom of the module. Yep.
That will make it fail.
And that one failed, okay. And I'll just mention that those 2 modules, when they fail, the failure mode is a high-speed rev limit type situation. With both of those modules, the car would start and run just fine, but as soon as you took it above about 5,000 RPM, it would be as if there was a rev limiter. So apparently the modules fail in this gross way, which is a good thing. You don't have to worry about it if you got this little misfire thing going on. Put that module way at the bottom of your list, because I've never found it cause a subtle problem. Okay. The cal packs, the calibration packs that have the ECM program on it, those we will have forever because they're erasable and recyclable. So it's like one of those parts, as long as you have an old one, you always have a new one, because we just recycle them forever. They can be erased thousands of times. So that goes on and on. Next slide, please. Slide, please.
No.
Slide. Gaskets. We're in heaven with gaskets. We have 4 suppliers for gaskets. Jerry makes very high gaskets, Jerry Downey. Some of the gaskets are still available from GM. The plenum gaskets are high quality but very expensive. The exhaust gaskets are very high quality and not expensive. And a few others. I really haven't purchased too many gaskets from GM recently, so I don't know what they have, but I know they have some. And then there's a couple of other suppliers. I should also mention at this point that if anybody's taken notes or looking for detailed information, this presentation is on my website already, so you'll be able to access it at home. Next slide. Clutch hydraulics. This is a major wear and tear item on the ZR-1. It has hydraulic fluids involved and heat underneath the car. Quite a bit of service gets done on these on the clutch hydraulics. I would imagine that most people here have visited this particular maintenance issue. There's plenty of suppliers. All these other suppliers have jumped into the market. Ray Besto's has units. I've used units from CarQuest. CarQuest has both units, the Master and Slave, and the iron. The iron configuration. It's kind of a reproduction that's made probably in China. And Dorman, I just recently purchased some Dorman parts. The Dorman Master happens to be the OE style, which surprised me. And I checked with my parts guy, and they have hundreds of them in stock. Now, I don't know if those are all going to be the steel OE style, but they certainly have hundreds of these pieces in stock. So these other suppliers are available. So basically, you can just go to your auto supply. Some of these are brands that might be, well, there's CarQuest. Anyway, AutoZone has a pretty broad coverage. I typically don't use AutoZone that much, so I don't know what they have, but it's always good to go to AutoZone and places like Advance even. So again, the point that I'm making here is that if you can't get the part from the dealer, I wouldn't even begin to get worried until you try a few other suppliers. Next slide, please. Smaller electrical parts. Oxygen sensors will have probably forever. GM used this particular sensor widely in many, many applications. The map sensor is an interesting piece. It's a very important integral part of the fuel delivery, the fuel calibration on the LT5. And it's not just a simple pressure sensor. I took one apart once, and there's actually a microcircuit inside. It's temperature compensated. It's a high-tech microcircuit. But luckily, GM's using them on the C1500 pickup trucks. So they're going to be available for a very long time. And even if GM stops supplying them, there'll be all kinds of suppliers jumping in, wanting to supply one of the most popular vehicles in the world.
My Pontiac 6000 from '86, identical.
Many applications. So we don't have to worry about these parts. Secondary vacuum sensor, that's the diagnostic sensor that the system uses to make sure that the secondary vacuum is correct. It's used on these other popular vehicles. Again, we don't have to worry about getting that part for the LT5 explicitly. The secondary vacuum solenoid, again, it's another piece. GM adapted an EGR solenoid valve. We'll always be able to get those. The secondary vacuum pump is an interesting one. GM discontinued both versions of the pump. There's a 90 version and a 91 and up version. The 90 version has a old non-sealed, non-weather pack connector on it. GM discontinued the 90 pump first. They discontinued the 91 and later pump. And then recently this pump has popped up, which is a drop-in replacement, an exact replacement for the 91 and later. It actually cost half as much as the part did with the LT5 part number on it. If you have a 90, you need an adapter connector because the connectors are different. The air temperature sensor, coolant temperature sensors, probably it's shared again with hundreds of other vehicles. Those parts will be available forever. In fact, those are even generic in some auto service lines. You know, I would imagine if you went to Standard Ignition or something like that, they probably have their own that they manufacture to this spec because it's just such an ordinary, common, simple piece. There's nothing but a thermistor in there, or there's a thermistor in there. Next slide, please. Ignition parts. The coils have a unique GM part number, which I find a little disconcerting. However, I've had plenty of cars come in, and I've had a few of my customers ask me to install MSD coils. They work great, no issues. So it can't be that critical. For now, MSD and Excel supply them, but this leads me to believe that these parts are probably, I would imagine that MSD is not making, well, in fact, I know they don't make a coil special for the LT5.
Yeah.
It's some broad application. Another part not to worry about.
You gotta wonder if it's in all those GM vehicles with the GIS ignitions or
Well, you know, I can tell you that a couple of years ago, I was in a hurry to repair a friend's Buick Regal, and I just took an LT5 coil and put it on it, and it worked great. The car's still running from years ago. So I don't know why they have a special part number, but apparently it's not. It seems pretty clear that it's not critical.
Exactly.
Spark plug wires. GM has a part number that's unique to the LT5. They might discontinue someday. They're very good, high quality wires, by the way. They're the same as the originals, except they don't say LT5 on them. MSD has a product that sells that fits very well And I know there's other suppliers that make spark plug wires, but it is important. I recommend the MSDs if you're going to go to a wire other than the GM wire, which, by the way, I think the GM wire set is just fine for all applications, you know, all the way up to 650 horsepower. But if you want to use something different, go with the MSDs because the wire lengths are almost the same. They're not identical, but you won't have any long wires to fool around with, trying to snake around and hide. Next slide. Water pump. It's still available from GM. Delco, that's the Delco part number for the same thing. Those are new pumps. Napa has a pump that I've seen, except it has a substitute impeller. The odd thing about the LT5 water pump is, it seems to me, it's one of these typical dual engineering things. The front of the pump is an English sized, it's 5/8, and the back of the pump, it's metric size. I can't remember the size of the shaft. So it's an SKF bearing, and SKF has a part number for it, but it's not available because they need to have an order for like thousands of them before they'll make them. So that causes a huge barrier. So companies like Napa, or suppliers like Napa, they have somebody that substitute impeller is probably an English size, an English size impeller on the inside, so they can just use a standard bearing. But I don't recommend it because the impeller is like the brain of your water pump. I don't recommend. I worry about substitutions on the impeller. But nonetheless, if nothing else is available, it's nice to know it's there. AutoZone, I did look for it, AutoZone's website, and they have it as a new and remanufactured. The new one is probably the same thing as the GM one because of this unique bearing. It's kind of hard to recondition. However, that doesn't stop me from reconditioning them. And what I do is I just take the standard bearing and I have it ground to the metric size, which is an expensive process. So my reconditioned pumps are priced about the same as a new one. So, you know, not necessarily a big incentive to buy one, but certainly if new ones ever disappear, again, as long as you have a broken one, we can always recondition it. It just costs a little bit more to customize the bearing. So again, another part not to worry about. Hopefully I'm making everybody feel better here instead of worse.
The shaft seal.
The shaft seal, well, I found the shaft seal. I had to go through a lot of special channels. I have an engineer that helped me with this, and I have the seals. But there is a common seal from Crane that it is a commonly available seal.
The face seal?
It's a ceramic seal.
The face seal.
Yeah. Ceramic on carbon. Mm-hmm. So the seals, I went through a lot of trouble to find these seals, but water pump manufacturers probably don't have any trouble. Water pump remanufacturers probably wouldn't have any trouble finding what I found. So again, no problem there. Common, it's a piece that you're always going to need. There's some things, I can see some cars going, 100,000 miles on a starter. It does happen, but it's pretty hard to get as far as 100,000 miles on a water pump, so everybody's going to need a water pump someday. So, at least everybody who likes to drive it. Next slide, please. Secondary throttle parts. These parts have become harder and harder to get from GM. I suspect that very few of them are currently available. The good news is that you don't really need them unless you have emissions testing in your state. Okay, now if you have emissions testing, it can be a problem, of course, because you got to have it for good low-speed fuel characteristics. But so what you have is you have the option now of finding parts. For example, on the third bullet, there's a lot of people. You can probably walk around today and find people that have taken them off their cars. If you know somebody like that, that person might be able to make a deal with you if you need a throttle shaft or an actuator or something like that. But ultimately, if you can find a part, the car runs just fine without them. You'll hardly even be able to tell. There's about 10 foot-pounds less torque at like 1,500 RPM. You'd have to be just looking as hard as you can to notice it. But other than that, you put the whole car back together without the secondaries on it, and it will drive just like it always did. You do have to reprogram the calibration and the ECM so that you don't get diagnostic errors and things like that. But it's a well-known thing that's easy to do. There's a vacuum tube assembly. My GM parts guy likes to call it the spider. And those are no longer available. You might find them on eBay for, obnoxious prices. I wouldn't worry about it. The tubing is just common industrial plastic tubing. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I bought a spool of it, and you can take, vacuum hose, and you can do all kinds of repairs on it. You don't have to have one of those things to service your car. Something else that is not an issue in terms of parts availability. And then finally, the pump that I mentioned before is available. That's a very commonly needed piece. And by the way, I should mention about that pump, they improved that pump. GM recognized one of probably the biggest problem with the pump on the ZR-1. The pump on the ZR-1 has the ventilation, the air vent is open, and it's located right on the edge of the hood and the front fascia, so it gets bathed in wash water and rainwater all the time. Half the ones that I see go bad because moisture gets inside and causes damage to the steel parts inside the pump. This new pump actually has a hose on that vent to address this particular water problem. Next slide, please. Is this really the next slide? Okay, next. Yeah, hoses. Oil cooler hoses. A major failure item. The hose goes bad on about 95% of the 90 to 92 cars, but they're easy to fabricate. They're available from a variety of suppliers. I make them out of Earl's components. I know Kurt White has them. I know a variety of people have just simply, you can take that assembly to a really good shop that does hydraulic hoses on trucks and heavy machinery, and they can duplicate it. Okay. In fact, I'm even thinking about going that route myself, because the Earl's unit, some of my customers have been complaining that it looks like a racing piece, and it looks out of place on a car that's otherwise totally stock. So I'm going to go and have the hoses made with the crimp-on fittings, because it looks a little bit closer to the original. So again, another item that's no problem to service, forever. On the engine coolant hoses, Samco makes a set of hoses for the front of the engine, and I've been able to find, by using a cross-reference catalog, I found other common hoses from other vehicles that fit the LT5 that I'll talk about more later. So those hoses, the hoses that I'm finding are from, again, common vehicles, just very popular vehicles that the parts should be available for at least 20 years. Next slide. The ZF transmission. This one can be scary because the transmission, I believe, is unique to 89 to 96 Corvettes. And I talked to Bill Boudreau. He's the world expert on ZF transmissions, and he says that he's not having any trouble or any hint of trouble getting parts from ZF. So no problem there. I found out that the drive shaft has the same diameter as a turbo hydro 400. So you can get that from your corner auto supply if you ever need a rear seal. That's a real popular item that you can probably get right close to you. So no concern there. Next slide. The clutch. They're available from many sources. A lot of these other sources, like I was mentioning, AutoZone and Advance and others. There's Carolina Clutch, independent suppliers. They're easy to get, but there's one problem that's coming up. Vallejo has discontinued the ZR-1 pressure plate. The ZR-1 pressure plate was made with a thicker plate. The whole assembly was made with a thicker plate for the pressure plate. I think, I don't know for sure, I'm guessing that it was so that it would take more heat before it got too hot. What's been happening with AutoZone recently is if you order the ZR-1 part, they have a ZR-1 part number and an L98 part number. If you order the ZR-1 part number, you get an L98 pressure plate. So it's a problem for some people because the unit is thinner, your bolts won't work. The bolts are too short, and you have to then acquire bolts. And so that's an issue. Once you get the right bolts for it, the pressure plate works just fine for street and heavy-duty street use. I've installed a couple of them for people. I'll talk to the owner about it, and if they just drive it again like normal heavy-duty street use, you won't notice any difference. It's only when you're drag racing that it could make a difference. If you're drag racing with if you're drag racing, you really should have the full thickness ZR-1 pressure plate. They can be found. You have to sort of beat the bushes. I can tell you one story about it is that AutoZone they've mingled their stock. So sometimes if you order two from them, one of them will be ZR-1 and one will be L98. So you can kind of play that game for a short time. What we really need is we need to convert the clutch. See, the big problem with the Vallejo clutch is that's a patented pull clutch assembly. Okay, other manufacturers can't duplicate it because it's patented. So that's why we'll never see, as far as I understand, a replacement, OE style clutch that works just like the Vallejo unit. I know for one, Ram makes a push clutch conversion, and that might be where we're going off into the future, is doing conversions. The only problem with that is you got to buy a new flywheel and it gets kind of expensive, but you certainly can get the parts and be able to go forward with it.
Is a new flywheel a dual mass unit?
It's not a dual mass unit. I haven't installed one. It's not dual mass, and it has a fair amount of mass to it though, so I'm not sure. It might work fairly well. Next slide. Next slide, please. And after all this, it makes me wonder if maybe one of the best suppliers for parts are ourselves. The ZR-1 is an interesting parts market insofar as I'm having trouble with the dry throat here. Could somebody get me a glass of water? Thank you. The parts market is interesting. With just 7,000 cars, it's a rather interesting number because it's enough of a population where a small business can actually get some good parts volume going. But it's not so big that you have to worry about if you wanted to make some of these ZR-1 only parts, you wouldn't have to worry about Napa, for example, jumping in and trying to compete with you because to them this car is just it's like a flea on the back of an owl, so they're not interested in. Excuse me. It is also interesting that these cars will always be around. You think in terms of your ownership of the car, but it's odd to think, but it's definitely true that someday, 100 years from now, when we're all gone, most of these cars will still be here. They'll be somewhere. People aren't going to be nobody puts a 53 Chevy into the crusher. These things are all out there and they live forever. Or a 53 Corvette, because these cars are considered special cars. So this parts market that I think is going to really develop over the years is also a long-term market. It's not just to serve us, it's to serve who you sell your car to someday and who that person sells it to, and it just goes on forever. It's also interesting to note that it's actually not a totally crazy thought to think that you could buy parts for a car that's 100 years old, because we can think of cars right now, old Fords. Thank you. Old Fords where parts are a whole market has sprung up to supply those cars.
You don't need to hear about the doors.
One door opens, another door shuts.
Okay, so next slide, please. These are the parts that I've jumped in. Like I say, I'm not in the parts business. I'm really in the service business, but there's some pieces that when I have to have them, I have to have them to go forward, and I've reproduced some of them. Emblems are sort of an opportunity that I ran into. I have the emblems, high quality reproductions. The stock rod bolts are a must, in my opinion, if you're rebuilding engines, because they're one-time use. They're torque to yield bolts, and you just don't want to take any chances with a rod bolt, because then you can get into the situation where you need a block, which you don't want to get, which you don't want to need because you can't get. So the rod bolts, I have ARP make reproductions for me. Camshaft bolts, another one. You got to have the correct camshaft bolts. If you try to reuse the bolt, there's a pretty good chance that the cam will slip. The cam timing will slip, and you'll have a headache on your hands. Oil cooler hoses, I just make with the Earl stuff. Anybody can really. And the upper chain guide facing that goes in the cam cover is something that isn't available anywhere else. Kurt White sends people to me to get them. Kurt has the rest of the guides, but he doesn't have that one because I have it custom made. And again, I had to have it, so I made it for myself primarily, but then I sell them, even though I'm not, it's not a main part of my business. We covered the water pump. Started to cover the coolant hoses. I found hoses from other applications. They're not exact replacements, they're very close, but they do work, and they will be available more or less, for many, many years, because again, they come from common vehicle applications. Next slide. Then I thought we'd have a little bit of fun with the top 10 list. What usually goes along with the phone call when somebody calls me up and says, I'd like to buy a ZR-1, but I'm afraid to because I hear you can't get any parts. After I tell them that you can get the parts, the next question out of them usually is, what should I look for when I'm looking, what kind of maintenance issues should I look for when I'm looking at a car? So I've come up with my top 10 list. Next slide. Number 10, selective ride control errors, okay? These parts are readily available. Generally, it's either an actuator or a shock. The bushings, most of them are no longer available from GM, the rubber bushings, but you can get urethane bushings from Energy Suspension, and they work great. So no problem there other than the expense. Lumbar pumps, just about all of them go bad after about 12 years. So you rarely see one that goes farther than that, so that has to be dealt with. It's easy to service. You can repair it yourself. Years ago, people were posting stuff on the internet about how to just fix it with a rubber glove or something crazy like that. I think you should use a thicker piece of material, but right, fine. But then almost, Dwight, it's almost not worth doing it because the whole assembly from Mid-America, they lowered the price. It's only like $40 now or something.
Nice.
So as long as they have them, it's almost a no-brainer. It's not worth fixing yourself.
When my rubber glove breaks?
There you go. And if you ever have trouble getting it anywhere else, you go back to the rubber glove if you can find it, or you can even go to the store and buy another one, right?
Absolutely. Well, I still have a bit of that rubber glove. I did both pumps, so.
You do.
So the secondary throttle vacuum pump, we cover that. We can use the pump from the Yukon truck that should be available for a very long time from GM.
Incidentally, Mark, what is that pump doing on the Yukon? What's its function?
What I heard, I don't know for sure, but I heard it's the diesel version of that truck.
Okay.
Needs a vacuum pump for some accessories.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of diesel Yukons out there.
Oh, yeah.
The Bose problem, speaker amplifiers. I bet you everybody here has had at least one go bad. But then they all go bad. So speaker amplifiers, the good thing is that you can recondition the amplifiers. I recondition them. There's a whole bunch of stereo shops around the country that recondition them. You can also get reproduction amplifiers. I like reconditioning them because you keep the original compensation. The compensation is wired into the module. If you get a reproduction, it's made for all cars, and it might not sound exactly the same. If you have to get a whole amplifier, believe it or not, Bose just started remanufacturing them. So you get high quality amplifiers from Bose, and they should be good for another 10 or 15 years, I guess.
That's who built the first one.
Pardon?
That's who built the first one.
I know, but you know, you got to keep it in perspective. It did last 15 years. You know, that's a long time.
Listen to your wonderful LT5.
That's right. I run into that more often than not, actually, Dwight. I'll be just, you know, somebody will bring a car over and they'll say, you know, check it all out, right? And one of the things I check out is I tell them, well, you know, the radio doesn't work. And the guy says, I never even turned the radio on. I didn't know that. So I guess we don't have to fix the radio. Oil pan leaks, pretty common. The interesting thing about the oil pan leaks are that, especially if you like to do things yourself, just tightening the bolts reduces it by about 90%. What seems to be happening, I don't really know for sure, but my guess is that the gasket shrinks initially after it's installed. And the bolts can be tightened, and usually after you tighten them, it stays tight. For some high mileage cars, I've actually seen bolts, they get so loose they'll actually fall out. But if you tighten them one time, the leakage will slow dramatically, and you'll find that they're tight next time. Another thing to look for, you know, another common problem, it depends. If you're a buyer of a car, these are things to look for. If you have the car, this is just our fun list of things that everybody here has encountered probably one time or another, or most people have. High idle speed, generally caused by vacuum leaks. The 90s have more possibilities for vacuum leaks than the others. Unfortunately, on the 90s, the vacuum leak is more or less under the plenum, even though if you're clever, you can service it without taking the plenum off. A sticky throttle, you know, the sticky throttle is a mechanical thing. Vacuum leaks are there all the time. The sticky throttle, if you kick the throttle and it gets better, well then you've got a sticky throttle as opposed to a vacuum leak. But another common problem. Runs hot. Simply just a dirty radiator. The radiator on the ZR-1 is a fine mesh, high efficiency radiator. It'll actually hold grains of sand. So it gets clogged up just like a filter would. So it's the third piece in the stack. If you try to spray it with water from the front, besides just driving the stuff in deeper, it's 2 layers down. You really have to take it out. If you take it out, you'll be rewarded though, because your cooling problems will probably go away. Clutch hydraulics. We talked about clutch hydraulics. Leaks. The parts are readily available, like we covered on one of the other slides. Oil cooler hose leak. We covered that a couple times. And then the number one problem. That's right. Shorted fuel injector. I think that 100% of the fuel injectors are going to fail after 5 years of exposure to ethanol. So that covers pretty much all the cars by now. So again, no problem. You can use Excel injectors. There's other places that sell Bosch injectors. I like the Excels because I use them a lot and they work perfectly, but that isn't the only game in town. You definitely don't want to use the GM injectors because the GM old stock is actually, you know, leftover production parts or parts they made during production for spares. So those parts will have the same problem down the road, so you definitely don't want to use those. And they're about $100 a piece too. Fuel injectors are no problem. You'll be rewarded with an engine that seems like a new engine after you put them in. And I should mention that the 93 and up cars, I've never seen a fuel injector go bad on a 93 and up car. And that is it, last slide. So it's on my website when you get home if you ever were craving for any of these part numbers or anything like that. So, you know, keep in mind that this is a living list, you know, insofar as a year from now, maybe these numbers will all be no good. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't emphasized that very much. But I just put them up just because I happen to know them and use them. It's easy for me. It's dynamically changing all the time. So, Tyler, question?
Fuel pumps.
Well, fuel pumps, I think everybody knows that the Suburban fuel pump works great. There's a,
Big block.
you could look it up on the ZR-1 archives. Look for, pardon? Thermostat housing, that's an interesting one. That's one of those parts that you don't want to need. But you generally should not have to get one. There's two things about the thermostat housing. First place, you already have a thermostat housing. You're in trouble if you're building a street rod, like I know a couple of people who are, and they need to have that housing, okay? But if you have a car, you're okay. The big problem is that the bolts break off, you get corrosion problems. The thing is that the housing's made out of aluminum. It's like infinitely reworkable. I mean, you know, you could try to fix it yourself, but if you can't fix it, you take it to an expert automotive mechanic, and you know, he'll drill those holes out, he'll put helicoils in, it can be welded and redone, and it's nothing to worry about big time. It's just an inconvenience, like I've been saying in the theme of this. Yeah, Ewing?
A few years ago, I had that problem with my DIS module. And you sent me your loaner, and we actually fixed that problem.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have one of the ones that actually had a bad DIS module, but my question is there a source at all for DIS modules?
Well, no. Well, I mean, well, right. I thought the GM had a few left. Jeff knows that they don't.
There are a few dealerships that still show them
Right.
in inventory, but
Right.
as far as like Lansing, Flint's, any of the main GM warehouses, you go into GM dealer world, they're gone.
Yeah.
Well, we tried to corner the
Northstar
market.
modules work?
Pardon?
We tried to corner the market.
Figured as
Would the
much.
Northstar modules work?
Well, that's a good question. I actually looked at that, okay? The nice thing about the Northstar module is there's 4 coils on it as opposed to like 3 coils that you have like on Grand National. So it's the right configuration. In my estimation, it's different electronically, but not totally different. I think that probably a good electrical engineer, if he worked on this for about a day and thought about it, he could come up with adapters to make it work. So ultimately, that is definitely doable. It's not just something that you can that you can do if you have only a, you know, it's not something a mechanic's going to do, but somebody who has an engineer as a consultant could pull it off.
Is the Northstar a wasted spark configuration?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it uses probably the same coils.
Yeah, they're the same coils.
Yeah, so they use a better triggering mechanism. They have a ×8 trigger, I think, that we don't use.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that have to be, probably put a little module on there that would adapt it. The connectors are different too. You'd have to have different cable adapters and a little module, I think, for the timing, or for the trigger.
You ever taken one of those modules apart?
Pardon?
You ever taken one of those modules apart?
I've never taken well,
The DIS one?
actually I did pry the cover off of one. I had one a while back. There's some big fets in the back corner. Yeah, made by Motorola.
How did you just pry it, is it conformal inside or what? That you could pry it apart?
Well, there's a what they call there's a thin film circuit on the inside. It's a ceramic circuit board. It's very unique and very complicated as far as the module itself goes.
Wasn't there a company a couple of years ago that was rebuilding them?
I can't imagine how you'd rebuild it. It'd be like rebuilding a light bulb, you know what I mean? It's all just very specialized stuff. It's all sealed up on the inside, and I have trouble picturing that.
Yeah.
But again, see, we shouldn't be talking about it. Don't worry about it. You're probably not going to have.
15 of them that failed, Mark. I know you haven't run across them, but I've seen them.
Now let's talk about the difference between parts that were changed and parts that failed.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, now this is what I do. Yuli knows this because I did this for him. I saved one of these modules that fails when it gets hot, okay? It starts up, runs just fine, you drive the car for about 15 minutes and you get this rev limiter going in, okay? Well, I saved this module, and when I have an ignition issue that brings the ignition module into question, I'll go and I'll put this on, drive the car for 15 minutes. If it behaves the same way, you know, if the problem, if this solves my problem until that means that the original module was defective. But usually what I find out is I put this module on and the car runs the same way. So now, and very quickly, I just move on. I put the original module back on, and I move on, and I find the bad coil or
Why do
whatever it
that?
is.
You got a DIS module checker, you can check that without having to do that. But anyway, I'm just saying, those modules fail more than you have experienced.
Where?
You and I disagree on that particular
We
topic.
disagreed on it before. Sir?
It's fine.
one type of failure?
The ones I'm talking about, just flat, quick working, period.
I had one that.
Now, again, were those factory installed, or were those ones that somebody took off and maybe possibly didn't use thermal compound
You're
on?
right, both times, both ways. But a failure is a failure.
Wait a minute.
No. Let's make a distinction here, Tyler. Most people here are not driving. Most people are driving cars. There's a few people that do their own engine, building and stuff around here. But if you're a typical ZR-1 owner, the module has never been taken off of your car. Okay. If you're one of those people, you really don't have to worry. The ones that are in jeopardy are the ones that have been removed for one reason or another. I hear these crazy stories. I had a guy call me up just 2 weeks ago, and he couldn't figure out how to get at the connector on the back of the ignition module. Okay, so you know what his solution is? He unbolts the ignition module, pulls it down, puts the connector on, okay, and then puts the thing back up. There you go. There's your recipe for a problem. Okay, the thing's been tampered with. But again, most people that are here are driving cars that maybe the plumb's been off, they have injectors put on, vacuum leak fixed. Ignition module's never been fooled around with. I'm very sure that you'll never have trouble with this module, so don't worry about it. Ron.
I had a 93 that the ignition module code, and I'm convinced it was corrosion related because the car for a short time was parked outside. Once it warmed up and dried out, it would never code again. But there's one kind of a little bit radical alternative. You can get aftermarket solutions which are coil on plug and run the ignition that way.
Well,
Totally doing the factory system.
that's possible too.
Yeah.
That might even be easier than converting a North Star module.
Well, I don't know if North Star would work or not.
Well, that'd have to be converted with, like I said, there's some engineering that's required. It's not just it's not something that a typical technician or a typical,
No.
this is something,
It's different.
this is like Lingenfelter-ish, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But it's not impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's alternatives.
right. Jeff, what was your question?
Well, it wasn't really a question, it was merely a statement. Anybody who is working on these cars needs to get a factory service manual. Because all that is stipulated in there about using the heat sink and
Right,
everything else.
right. Yeah. Well, I'll say that it's extremely important. That's really one of the most basic things. It also, to a large extent, Jeff, I've had people walking up to me this weekend asking me questions, and a lot of questions that people ask me that, if they had a scanner, they wouldn't be asking me questions because they can figure this stuff out themselves, So the scanners, it might seem like an exotic mechanics tool, but it's kind of like almost as important as having a good socket set when you've got a ZR-1.
You can't make a diagnosis without it.
Right. You're working blind. And what's interesting about that? That takes us into, one of these other kind of issues that's related to what we've been talking about here, and that is in the kind of like the old way of doing things that the GM dealers, their method to some extent was to throw parts at the problem because it's faster to change a part, right? Because they just, boom, they get out of their part system, they put a part on this car, it's under warranty, and they move on.
And they make
okay?
a lot of money.
And they can make more money that way, fine. The thing is, that's very parts intensive. Well, service doesn't have to be parts intensive. If you analyze your problem, if you can, do a logical, elimination process, looking at the symptoms, you might get lucky enough where you just come down where you need one part, and then it's not so bad. You don't need to have all the pieces of the ignition system to solve an ignition problem, right? Yeah.
And typically, when you see an ignition problem, it's almost never the DIS module.
Right. Oh, most definitely.
It's a coil.
Most definitely.
You tested my plug wires, I had shorts, I didn't even know it.
Right. Yeah, in a nutshell, ignition problems, of course, spark plugs are basic. Just change spark plugs. That's easy to do. If that doesn't do it, it's probably a wire or a coil.
Yeah.
I'd say it 98% of the time. Once you do that, you're going to be done. Yeah. Yeah, Ted.
You mentioned various sources to get parts, ranging from the dealer to the internet to your local parts store. How important do you think is, let's say, variability in quality? Like if I'm buying a water pump, which
Right.
is going to be a lot of work, I don't want to do all that work
Right.
and find out the pump.
Good question.
is crap.
Good question. Basically, it's hard for you because that part has to be tested. If you're in the service business, I'll put one on, and you know, for me, when I put one on, put a piece on that I've never used before, I'll talk to the customer about it so that he knows what's going on. And to some extent, this is now an experiment, you know. But then after you use it a couple times in this, you know, scenario, now you know you've got a proven one. So I don't have a really good answer for you, Ted. Stick to your community of ZR-1 owners here and find out what other people are using.
I'll call you.
Fine, you can call me, no problem. Yeah, Keith?
Mark, I noticed that, remember when you were doing my car this winter, there was one part that you talked about that came from GM, that was the ABS computer, the
Yeah, what about it?
module
Yeah.
that you had to replace. You said they were really hard to find, but then we found one on eBay.
Right, it was unavailable from GM.
So
Right.
nobody's addressed that particular part.
Well, then that's another rare failure item, okay? Yours failed, and that is, actually since then I've run into one more, interestingly enough. But those are the first two I've run into.
Did it coincide with too big a stereo in the back?
Actually, I tried to relate that, but it didn't, Dwight.
What, did it have anything to do with crushed wheel?
I can't imagine, I don't think that
Sheer weight resting on top of it, crushed it.
I have trouble drawing it. It would be easy to blame the stereo installation, but the thing is, the car's been running fine for a long time since, so it sort of proves it, because the problem came up right after the stereo installation, right? Well, that's a fact, and I tried to relate it, but I couldn't, and I don't think it is, because actually, my repair wouldn't have lasted.
Way before I put stereo in.
Oh,
It's just
okay.
when I brought the car to you,
Right,
I told you that, I called you and I said, that light's coming on. You
Fine.
said, well, we'll look at it when I get up there.
yeah,
And then you said, well, how long ago did you put the stereo in?
right,
And
real close.
I think it was the combination of the wheels and the stereo.
Actually, yeah, that is a bad combination.
It's bad.
So that's another piece, you know,
And then the Canadian slide. That nookish look.
I'll cover one more thing here too. You know, there's the ultimate supply for parts, and that is the so-called donor car. And donor cars are out there, okay? I can think of at least 3 cars that you can find in various places on the internet where people are stripping the cars. There's one guy that I know is in the business of stripping ZR-1s. It's Frogs on the forum, on the Corvette forum, right?
Well, he's pretty much done with.
Yeah, but you know, he's not the only guy, of course.
Yeah.
You know, there's
Colton's doing it.
there's-
Corvette recycling.
right. I mean, there's going to be cars that have had a bad life for one reason or another, and they've died more or less, and they're going to be a supply of parts. In fact, that's traditionally how the classic car world gets its parts. I mean, if you need a part right now for a 1938 Hudson or something like that, you know, there's a Hudson Club, and you can find the cars in the barns, you know, and stuff like that.
There's a fresh red 95 LSV sitting over Van Dorn's just going to be parted out.
All parts are good except for the door, I hear. Yeah. You caught Ron sleeping. So,
No, he's just ignoring me.
anybody else have a question? I think we're finished, right?
Good presentation. Mark, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You wanna, maybe we could put a little bit of this into the newsletter?
Well, sure. It'd be easy to, I can use pieces from the slides, right? Put something together for you?
I
Fine.
recall reading one of the earlier Heart of the Beast, and him presented a pretty good piece on the braking system. I thought you mentioned that there were.
AutoZone, I think, was rebuilding VBCNs or something.
Yeah, he said that. He said that in
I've
there.
never checked into it. I haven't come.
I always found that rather amazing because the traffic must be so low in them. I don't know how.
Well, that brake system was surely not just exclusive to ZR-1. was it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, and they rarely fail. I've only found one that went bad, and it wasn't the fault of GM or the car. The car,
It's a Bosch system, though, isn't it?
yes, it's a Bosch system. The only one that I've seen go bad was one where a body shop was working on the car and they parked it outside and they let the compartment fill up with water. It got submerged in water and destroyed it.
Awesome.
Again, it's not a piece that you should go and worry about needing for your car because you probably won't. It's extremely reliable. If you went around here all this weekend, you probably have trouble finding anybody that had one go bad. But it is good to know that Hib says they are available, and you know he's a reliable source. I mean, when he says things by his own standards, he better be darn right. So.
A good comment. All right, thanks a lot, Mike.
Okay, well, thank you too.